Okay, we're going to make a little bit of a leap today from the very simple applications that we were looking in PHP to a little bit more involved. I say application because this does sort of tie together several things. It's not just individual pages, it's a set of pages that work together to do something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these files over to my web server's root. Again, depending on whether you are running XAMPP or Microsoft IIS or whatever, your specific location of your web server root might be different. But for me, running IIS, my location is C, inetpub, www root. And I'm going to just clear out all these files that were there initially and paste my files in. Now, notice when I go to localhost, it brings up my home page right away without me having to type in a name of a page. Normally you would type in the server and then the name of a page. But with every web server out there, you can specify sort of some default pages. And typically they're either named like something like index.php, index.html, what would other ones be? Maybe default.html. You can actually configure that when you're setting up the web server. So that's why when you go to Google and type in google.com, you get a page. All right, you get the default page as defined on that server, just like here. When you just type localhost, you get the default page defined for this server. And it is for my fictional fitness company, which I actually think is a good idea. A fitness program for IT people, because we need sometimes to get our feet in the grass and get out from in front of a computer and maybe actually do something physical once in a while. So we look at this. One thing we'll notice is that there are 3 pages. There's a home page, which is pretty much static HTML, but I made it a PHP page anyhow. And we'll see why I did that in a minute. There's a chart page that shows for your age what your range of exercise ought to be. So in other words, if you are 40 years old, your exercise heart rate should be between 90 and 144. And the absolute maximum it should be is 180. Please don't take this as specific as exact medical advice. These are just numbers that I used from a website using some formulas that they have there. So we have 3 pages. Third page is a calculator where I can type in my age and I can type in how many beats I have for 6 seconds. So I would take my pulse for 6 seconds and let's say I have 12 beats in those 6 seconds. It'll tell me that I'm in the optimal exercise heart range. All right. And that corresponds to, if I were to look at 50, if I did 12 beats in 6 seconds, that would be 120 beats per minute, and that is within that range. So we're going to look at several things in this example that I think make this example meaningful. First of all, I'm following the programming adage of do not repeat yourself. So these 3 pages look the same, yet the code for each of these is in the same place. The code for the heading, the code for the navigation, and the code for the footer are all in the same place. Likewise, there's common code when I go in and build the chart, just like there is when I go in and use a calculator. So in other words, there aren't different places that these calculations are being performed. There's one sort of set of functions that get used in calculating both the range and the maximum, and whether your heart rate is within the optimal range for exercise based on your age. So that's a key point, I guess, of this exercise, is do not repeat yourself. So if we were doing this in CISS216, if we were making a site similar to this, we would have to make the site and clone it several times. So we would make the site with our appropriate header, with our navigation and footer, and then we would clone it. And the problem with that is if we needed to change the footer, for example, this is out of date, we would have to go into all 3 pages and change the HTML. PHP has something called include files. And include files are little files that can contain some code in them. What kind of code can it contain? It can contain HTML code, it can contain PHP code, and it can contain JavaScript, CSS, or any mix of those things. So essentially, anything that can be in a PHP document can be in an include file. So this is why, even if this is a static page, the home page is pretty much a static page. There's nothing that the server really calculates or anything on this page. Even though it is, I'm going to make it a PHP page so I can take advantage of the include files. So let's look at the home page. The home page you'll notice is a regular old HTML document, except with our CSS, except here, instead of having the actual header code and navigation code, we say include header.inc. Here we say include nav.inc. And finally, at the bottom, we say include footer.inc. So each of these include files contain a snippet of code. It contains the header, the navigation, and the footer. So if we were to look at the header include file, I didn't want to do that. I did want to open it with Visual Studio Code. All that's in the header include is the HTML code for the header section. Header, Planet Zellers, FIT, fitness for IT people. When I have an include file like this, whatever code is in the include file, the web server pretty much just pastes it right there. So when I say include header.inc, what I'm going to have is I'm going to have this block of HTML inserted at this point in my index.php. And the same thing for nav and the same thing for footer. So there it is. Let's pull up nav and let's pull up footer. These three sections are just blocks of HTML code. Now, again, they could be anything that's in a PHP file. So I could have PHP code here. I could have JavaScript here. I could even have CSS code. But in this particular case, I'm just inserting blocks of HTML in place of these include files. That allows us to put these sections of code in one place, and every page then shares them. So if I look at my calculator page, it also includes the header and nav and includes the footer. Therefore, when I go to my calculator page, the header, the nav, and the footer look exactly like the home page. So if I need to update something, let's update this date on the footer to 2023. Every page that uses that include file gets that update. If I were to add something, if I were to add another link in the navigation, put a link to some new page. Of course, I have to create some new page.php, but if I wanted to add it to the navigation, all I need to do is put it in the include for the nav, and then every page will get it. So this is different. If you were to do this on your CISS216 project, if you were to change the navigation section, you'd have to go back and change all the pages that you've cloned from your template. Whereas here we can just change the include file. So it's for this reason that if I'm doing a site with PHP, I won't have any HTML files in it. I'll make everything a PHP file because a PHP file can be just static HTML, and we get the benefit of being able to use include files like this to make sure and to ensure consistency in the page and the way the page works and the way the page behaves. And that's a good thing. In addition, we're not repeating ourselves. Think about this. If I want to change the way the page looks, I can change the CSS file. If I want to change the way the header looks, I can change the header include. I can change the nav include. To change the navigation, I can change the footer include for that. The only thing I need to then worry about, all that code is in one place, so each page gets it. The only thing I have to worry about then for each individual page is the stuff that goes in the section. So we're going to look at how we generate each of these two other pages, because that's where the real PHP functionality comes in. All right. Let's start by looking at the calculator. The calculator has a text box for age, text box for the number of beats per 6 seconds, and then a calculate that tells me whether I'm in the optimal heart range or not. Let's look at how that works. Look at the calculator PHP page. And you'll notice, first of all, that it contains those include files that I had before for the header, nav, and footer. It contains a form where the action is changeRange.php. The method is get, and on submit, return validate form. So we're going to look at this first of all, because this does client-side validation of the form. So whenever I try to submit this form, I'm going to first execute validate form. And what that's going to do is all it's checking is if there's some value in the age field. I'm going to make it a little better here by trimming it. In other words, getting rid of leading spaces and leading spaces. So I call this function. I assume that the page is valid. I set my errors to a blank string. I look to see if when I trim the value of the text age field, if it's an empty string. If so, then the page is not valid, and I create my error to say that it's missing an age. I then go and display the error in the inner HTML called errors, which is down here. And finally, I return be valid. So, how does that work? Right, there's no age in here, or if there's only spaces in here, calculate it, I display missing age. Now you may notice that I didn't validate beats per 6 seconds. If this were a real project, I would validate it. But I'm doing this to demonstrate that our server-side validation can have more validation than our client-side validation. In fact, I also don't validate that the age is numeric. So I can type garbage in here, and my result tells me age is not a number, but that result came from the server, not from the client, because we went to the second page. This returns a Boolean, true or false. It returns a true if the form is valid. It returns a false if the form is not valid. Here's how this works. I'm returning to the onSubmit event the result of this validation. If this returns a true, and I return the true to the onSubmit event, then the onSubmit event continues and I submit to the next page. If this returns a false, I return the false to the onSubmit event, and that cancels the submit. So if you notice here, if there's nothing in the age field, if I go to calculate it, it doesn't submit it to the second page. That's because this returns a false. That false that this returns gets sent to the onSubmit event, and that cancels the submit of the form. If everything goes okay, though, I will call the program checkrange.php. I'll pass the data on the query string, and I'll do that if this returns true. So let's put in valid data here. Notice the URL that gets called when I submit, and there's valid data. So when I submit, this function returns a true. This returns the true to the onSubmit event, and I go ahead and submit to the second page. Let's look at the URL that gets called, because this is important. All right. Put it on one line here. quite allowing me to. I should know how to. There we go. All on one line. So I call the page check range on the web server localhost. How do we know that it's a web server localhost? Well, because we haven't put any host name in front of this. We have not put any server name in front of this. So we're not submitting this to the Google site. We're not submitting it to some other site. We're submitting it to the page check range PHP on our server because there's no server before it. So it's on our servers, on our server and in the same folder as this page is, which is the root folder. txt age equals 40. txt beats equals 12. Button submit equals calculate. Those are the fields that came from the form. 40, 12, and calculate. If we look at this, age has a name of txt age. Beats per 6 seconds have the name of txt beats. And the button is the name bt and submit and a value of calculate. So that's how this maps to this. The name is used in this case, not the ID. Typically, for most forms, other than radio buttons, I give them both the same name and ID. So I put in 40 in txt age, so it says txt age equals 40. I put in 12 in txt beats, so when the URL I'm calling as txt beats equals 12, and finally I click that btn submit button, so I get its value. We pass the value of the submit button just in case we have a form that has 2 buttons on it. Again, the classic case of that is if you're pulling up a piece of data and you either want to update it or delete it. Well, that's 2 different actions that the server has to perform, depending on which button that you press. So you need to know what button got pressed. And you can tell what button got pressed by what button is in the query string and what the value of it is. So we're calling check range. Let's pull that one up. And let's see what check range does. First of all, check range has same thing as the other ones, and check range is this page, the page that gets called when we click submit. That's a different page than the calculator itself. Still has the header and nav and the footer, but it has 2 more includes. Now these includes are the PHP functions that are needed to do its job. Check range include I could put in this file, or I could put it in an include file. Part, however, I want to put in the include file. In fact, let me check. I might change my mind here. Yeah, check range include, I could actually put in this file. But by putting it in an include file, that kind of modularizes things and keeps things nice and clean. If we look at this page, we call the function validate form. If the form is valid, we display output. All right, that's all we do. Now, where is this validate form and display output? It is in that check range include. Here's the 2 functions, validate form and display output. I could have put it in the check range because no one else uses this check range code. So let's look what validate form does. Again, similar idea. It's going to assume that the page is valid until we find an error. However, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the value that we pull from the query string called txt age. That's what this means. The values associated with the request that has the name of txt age. And this works for both post and get. All right. We're storing that value in a variable age. So in our case, we're taking that 40 and putting it in the value of age. Likewise, we're putting 12 in beats. If is set age, that is asking if is set has a value. So it's looking to see if there's no value. If not, is set returns if there's a value, not is set returns true if there's not a value. So if there's not a value for age, then we're going to display, we're going to recognize that the form is not valid, and we're going to print out no value for age. So we're going to send that back to the client. Again, this is redundant checking from the client-side validation. The client-side validation also checked to make sure there was a value entered for age. However, as I mentioned before, it's possible to circumvent client-side validation. And therefore, we want to do the check on the server side. And we want to do more checking if possible. So we are doing more checking. We're also checking if there's anything in the beats field that we pulled off the query string. Then we check to see if they're both numeric. So no matter what I have here, so the server-side validation checks it and displays the error message. So if any of these error conditions are met, B value has a value of false. So it returns false, and therefore this page will not go ahead and display the output. If, however, there are no errors, in the form, this will return a true, which means that check range will go ahead and will display the output. So it calls the function display output. We clean this up and close some things and open some things. The one included I have not opened up yet is heart INC. Because if we notice that this includes both heart INC and check range INC. So check range INC, display output, gets the value for beats, gets the value for age from the query string. We know that these values exist and these values are numeric because we've already put it through the validation. If these were either non-existent or not numeric, it wouldn't have passed the validation and therefore it wouldn't have made it into the display output function. So at this point, we can confidently go ahead and do our math. So we call the function, is this in range? And we get one of three results back from this in range function. If it returns a -1, you're below your optimal heart range. If it returns a 0, you are at your optimum heart range or in your optimum heart range. If it returns a 1, you are above the optimal heart range. So if, for example, I entered in, there was 1 beat in 6 seconds, this person's below their optimal heart range. If it was 100 beats in 6 seconds, then you're above optimal heart range. But if it was 10 beats in 6 seconds, you're in your optimal heart range. Notice how I can look at this display output method and know what's going on, even without knowing the details of how it figures out. That is delegated to this function in range. So if I wanted to change an error message or something, I wouldn't have to look to see what this in range function did. I could just go and, not error message, but other message. I could just go and reword one of these things. Now let's look at Heart Inc., because this has all the actual calculations relating to your heart rate and exercise. It actually has 3 functions. The maximum rate, which is the absolute maximum rate, the lower end of the exercise range, of the optimal exercise range, and the upper end of the exercise range. Some comments would probably do good here. So this is the absolute maximum heartbeats per minute. If you're above that, then you need to stop exercising. Slow down. This calculates the lower end of the optimal range. This calculates the upper end of optimal range. This calculates whether heart rate and optimal exercise range. So there are some nice comments here. This function accepts the age of the person, how many beats for how many seconds. In this case, it's 10 seconds. How do I know that? Well, because that's what the screen says. Enter beats per 6 seconds. All right. So I figured out how many beats per minute that is per second, and I do it by performing this math. So effectively, if I'm doing 6 seconds, I'm taking their number of beats times 10. All right. So times 60 divided by 6 or times 10. I call to calculate the maximum optimal range, which is the maximum heart rate, 80% of it. I calculate the minimum range, which is the absolute maximum, 50% of it. So max and min contain the maximum beats per minute of the optimal range, and minimum contains the minimum of the optimal range. I then look to see if my beats per minute are less than the minimum, then I return the answer of -1. If the beats per minute are greater than the maximum, I return the value of 1. But if beats per minute is greater than or equal to the minimum and less than or equal to the max, then I'm in the range and I return a 0. So then based on what gets returned, I display the proper message. Notice how I mix PHP and HTML. Alternatively, I could have put an echo and echo these out, but I wanted to show how you can mix PHP and HTML this way. Whereas the if statements and the brackets are included in PHP, the output is included in HTML. So that's how this page works. Now, it's going to be important for us to note that when we look at the chart page, to calculate this range and to calculate the maximum, we're going to be using the same functions that are in Heart. Do not repeat yourself. We do not have two places anywhere within our application that calculates a person's maximum heart rate. It's in this function. We don't have two places to calculate the minimum exercise range or the maximum exercise range. They're in these functions. So therefore, if, let's say, medical science changed the rule for your heart range, and maybe your maximum was 85% of, maybe the maximum exercise was 85% instead of the 80% of the absolute maximum. We'd just change it in this place, and it would be changed everywhere throughout the application. All right, let's close this down and look at the chart page. The chart page is sort of just a fancier example of what we did in class last time, where we did a table that full of numbers and their squares. I include the heart functions, header, nav, footer. I have my for loop. It's going to start at 20 years old. It's going to go as long as the age is less than or equal to 80. And it's going to do it increments of age of 5 years. I'm creating my table. I'm outputting in the table. In the first table cell, I'm outputting the age. So the value of this variable. I'm then calculating the minimum exercise rate and maximum exercise rate. And I am outputting the value here. Again, one thing I mentioned last time is that later versions of PHP do not have these magic quotes. So another way of doing this would be like this. And if you are running a version that doesn't have magic quotes, you can simply concatenate those fields together. Use a period to concatenate. And it will work the same way. Finally, in the last cell, I call calculate max rate and send the age over there and get the absolute maximum heart rate, which is in this column, the last column of the table. It's really important for you to spend some time thinking about how to break down the calculations and other stuff that's going to make up your web application. For example, you're going to do something similar with students' tuition, where you're going to calculate the tuition here at LC based on this chart. Based on this chart. You're also going to have a calculator where you enter in how many credit hours and what their residency is, and it will give you the number. So if you type in 5 credit hours for an out-of-county resident, it will give you this number as a response. There should only be one function in your application that actually does a tuition calculation. Only one function that actually does a tuition calculation. And you can look at this and see how it works. There's actually 3 sections of this chart, 1 through 12, 13 through 18, and then 19 and above. So you're going to have to tell what range of this chart they're in and do the appropriate calculation that way. If any of you stuck on that, let me know and I'll give you a hand. Now, if I were going to change my Planet Zeller's fitness application, I might do this. You can actually combine the code from calculator and check range into one page. So it would actually submit back to itself. Let's see if I can do that in a couple minutes here. I usually show it as 2 separate pages because I think that's easier for people to get. But if you do understand that, then we could look at combining them. So I'm going to take the logic for check range. And the logic for calculator. And I'm going to do this. To take this snippet of code out. Put it here. Put an if statement around this. And I've divided this page into 2 sections. This is what I want to do if the page initially loads. This is what I want to do if this is the initial load of the page. Okay, so I can do this. Kind of winging this, so I hope this works. If is set request button submit. Do you include files in here? So if this will be close to what I want it to be, not exactly, but in the interest of time, let's check it out. Oops. I have a problem with this. It has a problem with this. Yeah. I'm confused here. Now, if I go in and put in the value and calculate, I'll have to change the method. Not the method, but the action. I can just say #, which means submit it back to this form. Or I can say calculator.php, or I can omit the action. And it will automatically submit back to this page. And it tells me, but I stayed on the same page. It tells me you're in the optimal heart range. So again, this wasn't optimal coding, but as you can see, what I did is I looked to see if the button was pressed to distinguish whether this is the first time that the page was being accessed or whether I clicked the submit button, in which case I need to validate and do the calculation. So this isn't perfect, but I think you can get the idea of how you would make it so that the code submitted back to itself. That's nice because you can do some cool things with your validation and not wipe out the values of the form and all that. That would be a little more extensive, but this is putting you on a track where you'll be able to do everything on one page instead of having two separate pages, one that does the entry of the data, one that does the validation and calculations. So that's what I have here. Please think about what you're going to write before you start writing code for the next assignment. Think of do not repeat yourself and think about separating things into include files and functions. All right, that's all I had for today. Have a good week. If I see you in lab, great. If not, have a good week. We'll see you next week.